September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. On the deck of the giant battleship Missouri, polished to a mirror shine, a silence had fallen, a silence as heavy as the air itself. A delegation of Japanese dignitaries in formal attire, their faces stone-like, impenetrable, prepared to sign the document that would put an end to the bloodiest war in human history. It was a moment of absolute, crushing defeat for a nation that, just a few years before, had dreamed of an empire. Then, at that very moment, like a terrible final chord, a final reminder of who now controlled the situation, a vast armada of bombers swept low over the bay. Silvery, shark-like silhouettes of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress blotted out the Sunday. They were a silent, yet eloquent, reminder of the terrible destructive power that had fallen upon their nation, a power which had turned its once flourishing cities into smoldering ruins. Before we begin, I just want to say one thing. This channel tells the stories of people forged from steel and fire, not ordinary flesh and blood. Those who fought for our future deserve to be remembered. If you believe that too, please subscribe. Every video here honors their memory. I voice each story myself because they deserve a human voice, not a cold AI one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if your family went through that terrible war, share a few words about them. Let's remember them together. All right, let's get to the story. Honestly, it was a reminder the Japanese didn't need. The scorched earth city blocks, the skeletons of buildings reaching for the sky, the crematoriums smoking nonstop across the country were proof enough of the firestorm that had swept over the land of the rising Sunday. Japan's national spirit wasn't just broken, it had been burned to ash. Nearly 70% of the people surveyed by the American military after the surrender admitted they had reached a point where they could not endure another day of war. Most Americans, especially the young soldiers, the Marines preparing for a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands, believed with all their hearts that the atomic bomb had forced Japan to surrender. They were wrong. The truth is, the country was already on its knees even before the first atomic mushroom cloud rose over the New Mexico desert. Japan's will to fight had been incinerated by fire from the sky, fire delivered from the bomb bays of an armada of B-29 aircraft. But the path of this weapon to dominance in the skies over the Pacific was long, winding, filled not only with engineering breakthroughs, but also with political intrigue, personal ambitions. By September of 1945, the B-29 had become the symbol of American air power, but this giant four-engine bomber was initially conceived as a weapon for a war against a completely different enemy, Nazi Germany, back in the autumn of 1940. As America watched with alarm while Europe descended into darkness, a competition was announced to create a bomber with extreme long-range capability. The idea was to have a weapon capable of striking Berlin from bases on the American continent should Britain fall. This required a technological leap, a pressurized cabin for the crew, remote-controlled gun turrets, the ability to carry tons of bombs for thousands of miles. But design problems, delays in production led to the plane missing its intended war. When the first production B-29s began rolling off the assembly lines in mid-1943, it became obvious that such a massive range for striking Germany was no longer necessary. Yet, a new, perfect machine now existed. Commanders in all theaters of war began demanding it for themselves. Lieutenant General George Kenney, General Douglas MacArthur's air commander in the Southwest Pacific, was particularly insistent. Kenney felt he was constantly being shortchanged, with priority always given to the European theater. He wanted the best weapon to crush the Japanese. But the commander of the Army Air Forces, General Henry Hap Arnold, had his own plans for this superweapon. These plans were dictated not only by strategy, but by personal ambition. Despite his high rank, Arnold had never been in combat, had never commanded men in battle. He saw the B-29 as his chance to go down in history as a combat commander. Instead of assigning the new bombers to existing air forces, he decided to create an entirely new structure, the 20th Air Force. It was unique, it answered to no theater commander, it answered personally to Arnold. Its headquarters was located in Washington, thousands of miles from the war. Arnold, his staff, would be the ones to choose targets, to manage every mission, playing a war game on a world map. It was an unprecedented decision that caused quiet frustration among combat generals like MacArthur, like Kenney. The final decision on where the B-29s would be deployed was dictated by high politics. President Franklin Roosevelt was obsessed with the idea of starting the bombing of Japan as early as possible. In 1944, he was facing an election for an unprecedented third term. Beginning raids on Japan could significantly strengthen his political position. Despite the B-29's immense range, there were only a few places in the world from which they could reach Japan. Soviet Siberia was out due to the USSR's neutrality. The Aleutian Islands out because of the horrific weather. That left two options: the Mariana Islands, which still had to be captured at the cost of immense blood, or forward bases in China. Arnold, under pressure from Roosevelt, chose China. Operations from China would allow the campaign to start several months earlier, plus it would boost the morale of the Chinese who had been fighting Japan since 1931. Command of the first B-29s was given to Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe, a man who knew the aircraft down to its last bolt. He developed an ambitious plan, codenamed Operation Matterhorn. The B-29s were to be based in India, near Calcutta, then for the attacks themselves, fly to forward airfields in Chengdu, China. It was a logistical nightmare. All military operations in China depended entirely on airlift over the Himalayas, a route known as the Hump. It was the most dangerous air route in the world, flying over the planet's highest mountains. Wolfe proposed an audacious, almost insane idea. His bomber command would be completely self-sufficient. The B-29s, the most advanced, most expensive bombers in the world, would have to haul their own fuel, their own bombs, over the Himalayas, essentially becoming their own transport planes. Every combat sortie to Japan required several grueling transport flights over the Hump. To maintain secrecy, the War Department even spread disinformation that the B-29 project had failed as a bomber, that the planes were being converted into armed transports. It's unlikely the Japanese believed it. The first Superfortresses began their long journey to India in March of 1944. One of the first planes demonstratively made a detour through England, where it was put on display. It was a propaganda stunt, meant to convince the Germans that this new American weapon would be used against them. But the true target of these silver giants lay on the other side of the world. By April, they began arriving in India. The crews immediately faced the harsh reality of Operation Matterhorn. Their B-29s, the most advanced, most complex bombers ever created, had been turned into beasts of burden. Their first combat duty was not a bombing mission, but the grueling work of hauling cargo. Day after day, they loaded their bomb bays with fuel drums, crates of ammunition, with spare parts, then flew east to the forward airfields in China. Their path lay over the Hump, the frozen roof of the world, the Himalayas. It was the most dangerous air route on the planet. The Superfortresses, heavily laden with fuel, had to climb to incredible altitudes where the thin air barely supported their wings. They fought against hurricane-force winds that could drop a plane thousands of feet in seconds, against sudden ice storms that formed out of nowhere. Japanese fighters based in Burma often set up ambushes on this route, turning logistics flights into a deadly game. For the B-29 crews, it was a profound humiliation. They had trained to fly a weapon that cost millions of dollars, not to work as long-haul truckers on the most dangerous road in the world. General Wolfe's logistical plan to be completely self-sufficient quickly proved to be overly optimistic. The Superfortresses simply couldn't transport enough resources. The Air Transport Command had to be brought in, which only added to the chaos. Then in May, the situation became catastrophic. The Japanese launched a major offensive in China. The local commanders, finding themselves on the brink of defeat, began confiscating supplies intended for Operation Matterhorn. They couldn't afford the luxury of feeding an ambitious project that had yet to fly a single combat mission. Meanwhile, Arnold was applying pressure from Washington, with the president himself behind him. The first combat sortie had to happen at any cost. The target chosen was a railroad depot in Bangkok, Thailand. General Wolfe, understanding that his crews were exhausted from transport flights, that they lacked experience in formation flying, wanted to conduct the mission at night to minimize the risks. But he was rudely overruled. Arnold and his staff, composed of veterans from the European campaign, were apostles of daylight precision strikes. The order was categorical. The first B-29 mission had to be a daylight one. Wolfe was forced to postpone the mission to hastily begin a training program. By June 5, 1944, he had assembled 112 Superfortresses ready for combat. But from the very beginning, everything went wrong. Only 98 aircraft managed to take off. One of them crashed immediately after takeoff. The weather was so horrific that the B-24 bombers meant to support the attack simply canceled their sortie. Low clouds, poor visibility turned the assembly into combat formations into complete chaos. 14 planes aborted the mission due to technical problems or an inability to find their group. Those that remained flew on to Bangkok, but over the target the chaos only intensified. Many crews couldn't find the railroad depot. Those that did bombed it over a period of an hour and a half, with each crew independently choosing their altitude, their attack course. One navigator later described the scene as a Saturday night in Harlem. There was almost no Japanese resistance, but on the way back another enemy awaited the Americans' monsoon thunderstorms. 3 superfortresses never returned, disappearing into the ocean due to a lack of fuel. Over 40 planes made forced landings at random airfields all across China. Another crashed upon landing. Total losses amounted to 5 brand new B-29s, 17 crew members. When reconnaissance photos were finally analyzed, the result was devastating. The damage to the target was minimal. Nevertheless, the 20th Air Force in Washington declared the mission a success. The very next day, Wolfe received a new order from Arnold. By June 20th, strike a target in Japan itself. It was an order bordering on madness. Supplies at the Chinese airfields were depleted. General Joseph Stilwell, the senior American officer in China, had redirected all supplies to the 14th Air Force, which was engaged in fierce fighting. Wolfe sent a telegram to Arnold stating he could get 50 planes in the air on June 15th, or 55. 5 days later, the reply from Washington was ruthless. 70 planes on June 15th. The target was the Imperial Iron Steel Works in Yawata. The date was not chosen by chance. On June 15th, the invasion of Saipan was beginning. Washington wanted to send Tokyo an unambiguous signal. Wolfe managed to get 92 planes to China, but they needed fuel, rest for the crews. Of the 75 planned aircraft, only 68 managed to take off. 1 crashed, 4 turned back, 63 headed for the target. The first plane reached Yawata around midnight. The weather was clear, but the factory itself was blacked out. Smoke, haze interfered with visual aiming. Only 15 crews managed to bomb visually. 32 used radar, which at the time was considered an inaccurate method. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, fighter opposition, not a single B-29 was damaged over Japan, but 6 planes were lost for various reasons on the return trip. 55 crew members went missing. The damage to the factory was insignificant. But this time, the mission had a huge psychological effect. For the first time since the Doolittle raid, war had come to the Japanese homeland. The next day, the War Department officially announced the existence of the 20th Air Force. The news of the bombing of Japan competed in the headlines with news from Normandy. Arnold demanded that the pressure be increased. Wolfe, understanding the limits of his resources, proposed a plan for 50 planes against steel mills in Manchuria instead of the 100 Arnold demanded. In response, he received a telegram ordering his immediate return to the U.S. for an important assignment. He was promoted, sent to command the Materiel Command. Arnold had simply removed a commander who was too cautious for his taste. Responsibility for operations fell to Brigadier General Laverne Blondie Saunders. He continued to follow the failing strategy. On August 10, 1944, simultaneous strikes were launched on oil refineries in Palembang, the docks in Nagasaki. The raid on Nagasaki was minor, only 24 bombers, but it was in this mission that gunner H.K. Edwards scored the first officially confirmed aerial victory for a B-29. On August 20th, 75 planes again took off toward Kyushu. 61 aircraft bombed the target, but the resistance was fierce. 4 bombers were shot down. 3 of them may have been victims of the first ever kamikaze ramming attack, when a fighter slammed into the tail of one B-29, its debris knocking down 2 more. Total losses for that day amounted to 14 bombers, 95 crew members. Japanese records later showed that the target was barely damaged. Operation Matterhorn was turning into a bloody, senseless waste of America's most expensive planes, finest crews. By the end of the summer of 1944, Operation Matterhorn had descended into a bloody farce, the most expensive military project in U.S. history, costing more than the Manhattan Project, was failing. The bombers that were supposed to bring Japan to its knees couldn't inflict any significant damage. Instead, they were being lost by the dozen in combat sorties, accidents, a logistical hell. General Hap Arnold in Washington, the founding father of this ambitious project, was furious. He had removed the cautious General Wolfe, but his successor, Blondie Saunders, continued to beat his head against a wall. trying to execute unrealistic orders with a failed strategy. What was needed was not just a new commander. What was needed was a butcher. Arnold found such a man. His name was Curtis LeMay. At that time, the 38-year-old Major General LeMay was already a living legend. In Europe, he had commanded the 3rd Bombardment Division, earning a reputation as a ruthless, pragmatic, incredibly effective commander. He personally led his flying fortresses on the most dangerous raids to understand what was happening in combat. He was obsessed with results. He had absolutely no tolerance for excuses. When LeMay arrived in India to take command of the XX Bomber Command, every tired, demoralized B-29 crew member understood the game had changed. Before changing anything, LeMay decided to see everything for himself. He flew on the next mission, another raid on the steel mills in Manchuria, as an observer. The attack, conducted according to Saunders' plan, caused significant damage to the Showa plant. It was one of the few successes, but for LeMay, it wasn't enough. He saw chaos, inefficiency, weakness in the tactics. Returning to base, he began to dismantle everything that came before him. He immediately changed the basic combat formation. Instead of scattered groups of 4 planes, he ordered them to fly in tight formations of 12. This allowed for a wider, denser bomb carpet, plus it enhanced mutual defensive fire. He reorganized the groups, making the squadrons larger to reduce support personnel, improve maintenance. He introduced a new policy of synchronous bombing, where one bombardier aimed by radar while others tried to find the target visually, which increased the chances of a hit. But even LeMay's genius couldn't change the fundamental problem. The strategy was flawed. The XX Bomber Command conducted one more mission against the Showa steel plant. Despite all the new tactics, the result was zero. The bombs simply couldn't inflict critical damage on the massive, well-fortified industrial facilities. LeMay realized that trying to break through a concrete wall with his forehead was pointless. The days of Operation Matterhorn were numbered. LeMay radically changed priorities. Instead of steel mills, the B-29s began hunting more vulnerable targets: Japanese aircraft factories, airfields on Formosa, mining rivers, harbors to cut supply lines. It was at this moment that General Claire Chennault, the legendary commander of the Flying Tigers, the 14th Air Force in China, approached him. Since June, Chennault had been begging the B-29 command to launch a single massive incendiary bomb strike on the Japanese warehouse, the port at Hankow. It was the main logistics hub through which the Japanese army received everything needed for its offensive in China. But Wolfe, Saunders, fixated on precision attacks on steel mills, had ignored him. Now the situation had changed. The Japanese offensive threatened the American bases in China themselves. Chennault, supported by the new commander in China, General Wedemeyer, again made the same request. LeMay initially questioned their authority. After all, his command was based in India, reported to Washington, but General Arnold, realizing a catastrophe was brewing in China, gave his consent. This was not the first use of incendiary bombs. Back in November of 1944, several experimental attacks on Tokyo had been launched from Saipan, but they were unsuccessful. But the attack on Hankow surpassed all the wildest expectations. On December 18, 1944, 84 Superfortresses became part of a huge armada of over 200 aircraft that headed for Hankow. Despite the first wave mistakenly dropping their bombs from the windward side, which could have dispersed the fires, the result was stunning. The M69 explosions created giant pillars of fire. The wooden docks, the warehouses filled with ammunition, fuel, went up like dry straw. The fire was so powerful it was impossible to extinguish. Intelligence estimated that 38% of the bombs dropped destroyed 50% of the target. General Chennault wrote in his report that Hankow, as a military base, had ceased to exist. This raid became a turning point. It proved two things. First, that precision strikes on fortified targets were a waste of resources. Second, that the B-29, armed with incendiary bombs aimed at more vulnerable, soft targets, transformed into a weapon of apocalyptic destructive power. The lesson of Hankow was learned. Operation Matterhorn, that logistical nightmare, was coming to an end. But the concept born in its fire was preparing for its true, horrific debut in a new theater of war. On the Mariana Islands, runways were already being prepared for a new B-29 armada. At the head of this armada would soon be the general who had just learned how to burn cities. The lesson learned in the fire over Hankow was unequivocal. The future of the war belonged to incendiary bombs. But while LeMay was drawing his first bloody conclusions in China, The main strategic chessboard was already shifting. The titanic efforts of the U.S. Marines had finally borne fruit. In the summer of 1944, the island of Saipan fell. This victory, won at the cost of thousands of lives, opened up the perfect staging ground for the B-29s, the Mariana Islands chain. Located much closer to Japan, Operation Matterhorn, with its logistical hell over the Himalayas, was living out its final days. A new main phase of the air war against Japan was beginning. On October 20th, 1944, the headquarters of the 73rd Bomb Wing was opened on Saipan. Command of the new XXI Bomber Command was entrusted to Brigadier General Haywood Possum Hansel. If Curtis LeMay was a pragmatic butcher, Hansel was a theorist, a true believer. He was one of the architects of the American doctrine of strategic bombing, which was almost a religion. Its main dogma was simple. Armadas of heavy bombers, flying in tight daylight formation, could defend themselves, could, through high-precision strikes, destroy an enemy's industry, bringing them to their knees. This theory had been failing spectacularly for years over Germany until escort fighters appeared. Now Hansel intended to prove its validity in the skies over Japan, but from the very first day, he faced the same problem as his colleagues in China, a shortage of aircraft. It was expected that 5 superfortresses would arrive on Saipan per day, but in reality, only 2 or 3 would fly in. The giant planes were scattered across the entire Pacific, from Kansas to transit bases, suffering from endless technical problems. The new command's first combat mission was, in essence, a training exercise. A strike was carried out on the Japanese base on the island of Truk, which at that point had already been practically destroyed by Navy aviation. It was a safe flight, a milk run. The irony was that General Hansel's own plane, the architect, the commander of the entire operation, aborted the mission due to technical problems. He never reached the target. It was a bad omen. A few days later, his successor, Brigadier General Loris Norstad, citing a new directive, forbade heavy bomber commanders from flying over enemy territory altogether. Hansel, the theorist of precision strikes, now had to manage his war from the ground, having never seen it with his own eyes. When operations against Japan finally began, it became obvious that Hansel was not in charge. All orders came from Washington, from Arnold's 20th Air Force. The primary target was identified as the Japanese aircraft industry. But it was decided that the first mission would strike not the most important, but the most high-profile target, the Nakajima factory in Musashino, a suburb of Tokyo. The main reason was propaganda, so the headlines in American newspapers could scream, "Tokyo bombed." The strike was to be a daylight, precision one in accordance with Hansel's doctrine. The plan, codenamed San Antonio I, was based on wildly inflated intelligence data. Analysts believed that between 600 and 1,100 fighters were concentrated in the Tokyo area, although in reality Japan had only 375 planes to defend the entire country. The raid was planned for early November, but the weather had other ideas. Rain poured for a week. Finally, the morning of November 24, 1944, dawned clear. 111 superfortresses roared off the runway on Saipan. The formation was led by General O'Donnell. Serving as co-pilot in his cockpit was Major Robert Morgan, former commander of the legendary B-17 Memphis Belle. But from the very beginning, nothing went according to plan. 17 planes aborted the mission due to technical malfunctions. Bad weather over Tokyo, strong winds prevented another 6 from dropping their bombs. But the Americans' main enemy that day was not Japanese fighters, not anti-aircraft guns. It was an invisible, relentless monster whose existence they had only guessed at the high-altitude jet stream. At 30,000 feet where the B-29s were flying, a hurricane-force wind was blowing at over 200 miles per hour. It tossed the multi-ton aircraft around like toys, blowing them off course. Bombardier, looking into their state-of-the-art Norden bomb sites, realized with horror that they couldn't calculate the trajectory. Precision bombing under such conditions was impossible. Only 24 planes managed to bomb the primary target in any capacity. As it turned out later, only 48 bombs hit the factory. The damage was negligible. However, the raid had a huge psychological effect. The leaders of Japan suddenly realized that the war they had been fighting thousands of miles from home had come to their doorstep. Missions against aircraft factories continued until January, but the results were meager. Again, the B-29s encountered a virtual wall of storm fronts between Saipan, Japan. Again, the jet stream turned their bombs into a random rain of death that fell anywhere but on target. Hansel's doctrine was falling apart at the seams. Meanwhile, the pressure from Washington was mounting, demanding the start of experimental incendiary attacks. Hansel, the true believer in precision, resisted. He considered it barbarism, a departure from doctrine. But the success of LeMay's raid on Hankow on December 18th became his sentence. Norstad ordered a full-scale incendiary attack on Nagoya. Hansel protested. Only on January 2nd did he reluctantly conduct a small test raid. 3 days later, Norstad personally flew in from Washington to inform Hansel he was being relieved of command. In his place, from China, was being transferred General Curtis LeMay. Then came the final, most bitter irony of Hansel's career. On January 17th, in the last days of his command, 73 Superfortresses struck the Kawasaki factory. It was one of the best precision missions of the entire war. Intelligence estimated the damage at 38%, but Japanese records later showed the factory was 90% destroyed. Hansel's doctrine could work, but only under perfect conditions, which occurred once in 100 sorties. This success came too late to save his career. The era of precision strikes on Japan was ending. The era of fire was beginning. The era of General Hansel, the era of true believers in high-altitude precision bombing, ended in disgrace. He was removed from command at the very moment his doctrine finally produced a single successful result. But war has no patience for flukes. It demands a system. The man who was to build that system was a general whose name had already become synonymous with ruthless efficiency. From China to the Mariana Islands, Curtis LeMay was being transferred. His arrival did not initially bring about drastic changes. The crews, expecting a revolution, saw only a continuation of the old, failing tactics. LeMay, being a pragmatist, first tried to make the existing system work. On January 23rd, he requested permission from Washington to attack more lightly defended targets to give his crews some kind of victory. General Norstad's reply was cold. LeMay had complete freedom in choosing targets, but perhaps an incendiary strike on the city of Kobe would be more fruitful. LeMay, as he himself said, knew which side his bread was buttered on. He planned a massive raid on Kobe for February 4th. It was to be the largest mission to date, involving 2 bomb wings. But from the very beginning, things went wrong. Of the 129 planes that took off, only 69 reached the target. Technical problems, horrific weather continued to eat away at his armada before it even entered combat. Those that made it dropped their incendiary, high-explosive bombs from high altitude. The results were moderate. Japanese records showed that about 1,000 buildings were destroyed, but this was not the total annihilation Washington was looking for. The next target was the Nakajima aircraft factory in Ota. It produced Japan's new Ki-84 Frankfighter, a machine that could operate at high altitudes, posing a serious threat to the Superfortresses. Striking this factory was a matter of survival. But, again, a mixed result. The bombing accuracy was terrible. Only 7 incendiary 93 high-explosive bombs hit the factory grounds. But even those 7 incendiary bombs worked wonders, starting fires that destroyed 37 buildings, 74 brand-new fighters. The price, however, was terrible. 12 bombers were shot down. 29 were damaged. LeMay looked at the reports, realizing he was going nowhere. The losses were unacceptable. The results were unpredictable. Washington was pressing. Norstad reminded him that the effectiveness of incendiary bombing was still unconvincing. LeMay planned another massive raid on Tokyo for February 25th. Of the 231 aircraft, 172 reached the target. Clouds covered the city. They had to bomb by radar. The fires destroyed about 1 square mile of urban areas. The Japanese reported 28,000 buildings destroyed. It was a success, but again, not total. In early March, LeMay, in a conversation with his press officer, expressed his frustration. He complained that the unit was getting a lot of publicity without having achieved almost anything in terms of bombing results. He had reached his boiling point. The old system wasn't working. A new one was needed. Then, a new, terrifyingly simple, brutal plan was born in LeMay's mind, a plan that went against the entire doctrine of the U.S. Army Air Forces. He analyzed all the failures, realized there were 3 enemies: Japanese fighters, Japanese anti-aircraft guns, the main enemy, the jet stream. Precision bombing from 30,000 feet was a lottery because of the hurricane force winds. Therefore, altitude had to be abandoned. Decision 1. Attack. at night. LeMay knew that the Japanese night air defense system was poorly organized. Their anti-aircraft guns were less accurate at night than Germany's. Decision 2. Attack from low altitude. From 5,000 to 9,000 feet. This was a radical, almost suicidal move for an aircraft designed for the stratosphere. But the logic was ironclad. At that altitude, there was no jet stream, which guaranteed accuracy. The planes would also be below the effective zone of heavy anti-aircraft guns. Decision 3, the most shocking, strip the planes of almost all their defensive armament. The machine guns, the cannons, most importantly, the tons of ammunition for them. LeMay was betting that at night, Japanese fighters would be almost helpless. The lightened planes could carry far more bombs, far more incendiary bombs. Decision 4, attack individually, not in formation. This broke the sacred principle of mutual defense, but flying in tight formation at night was dangerous. Instead, a stream of planes, one after another, could create a continuous wave of destruction. This wasn't just a new tactical plan, it was a new moral choice. Attacks on civilian populations had previously been considered immoral, but now Washington had found a justification. The Japanese government had declared total mobilization, making all men up to 60, women up to 45, part of the national defense. The wooden, densely packed Japanese cities, where every house was also a small workshop working for the war effort, were now viewed as one single military target. LeMay's plan was ready. He developed the tactic. The first planes would drop napalm bombs to create giant fiery crosses in the center of the target markers for the following waves, a lure for the fire departments. The main force of bombers would drop clusters of M69 incendiary bombs, creating a solid carpet of fire. The target was Tokyo. The date, the night of March 9th to the 10th, 1945, 334 Superfortresses were to take to the air. The crews were briefed on the new orders. They were shocked. Fly low, at night, nearly unarmed, over the capital of the enemy empire? It sounded like a one-way ticket. But an order was an order. Iron Ass, as LeMay was nicknamed, gave the Japanese no chances. As it turned out, he gave his own crews none either. A night was approaching that would change the face of war forever. The night of March 9th to the 10th, 1945. The runways on Saipan turned into a roaring hell. Every few seconds, another giant B-29 soared into the darkness, its four engines creating a thunderous roar that made the ground tremble. 334 Superfortresses. It was the largest armada ever assembled in one place. It took 3 hours to get this entire mass into the air. In the cockpits, a tense, almost funereal silence reigned. The crews had received their orders. They couldn't believe them. Fly low, at night, nearly unarmed, over the most heavily defended city in the world, Tokyo. It didn't sound like a tactic, it sounded like a death sentence. Many silently said their goodbyes, certain that General LeMay had simply lost his mind, had decided to sacrifice them for some insane experiment. But an order was an order. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness, heavily laden not with the usual high-explosive bombs, but with thousands of tons of incendiary jelly. On the way to the target, they encountered their usual enemies, thick clouds, violent turbulence, but this time, a new psychological fear was added. They were almost naked. Their remote-controlled turrets, once their pride, were silent. They flew on, relying only on the darkness, on the audacity of their commander's plan. But when they approached Tokyo, the first miracle happened. The weather over the city was perfect, a clear, starry sky. The city lay beneath them, as if in the palm of a hand, illuminated by the moon. The Pathfinders went in first. Their job was to draw a fiery cross on the ground to serve as a marker for the main force. They dropped their napalm bombs. In the densely packed wooden districts, the first fires erupted. Then the inferno began. The main force came in on the target in waves, at altitudes from 4,900 to 9,200 feet. The crews, accustomed to the icy silence of the stratosphere, were shocked. They could see the city lights, the streets, even individual houses. They were flying so low they felt completely defenseless. They began to drop their cargo. These were not ordinary bombs. They were clusters of dozens of small M69 incendiary bombs. As they fell, they broke apart, scattering a rain of fire over a vast area. Each bomb, upon hitting a roof, would explode, spewing a jet of white phosphorus that burned through the thin wooden walls, igniting everything inside. What LeMay had calculated began to happen. But even he, in his most audacious calculations, could not have imagined the scale of what came next. The wind blowing over Tokyo that night was unusually strong. It caught the thousands of small fires, began to fan them, merging them into one gigantic, unstoppable sea of flame. Within minutes, a firestorm was born. It was a phenomenon that defied the laws of nature. The fire created its own meteorological system. Superheated air rushed upwards at incredible speed, creating a vacuum near the ground that sucked in fresh air from the periphery. This created a hurricane-force wind at ground level, blowing not in one direction but from all sides toward the center of the conflagration, fanning the flames even more violently. The temperature at the epicenter reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. For the B-29 pilots coming in to bomb, it turned into a nightmare. Their multi-ton aircraft were thrown up, down, thousands of feet by invisible thermal currents. The cockpits filled with the acrid smell of burning wood, human flesh. Some of the planes at the lowest altitudes were literally scorched, their aluminum skin blistering from the heat. But what was happening below was beyond human comprehension. The target was one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Wooden, paper houses ignited like dry kindling. The fire spread faster than a person could run. People fleeing into the streets were caught in a fiery hurricane that ripped the clothes from their bodies, burned them alive. Thousands rushed to the rivers, the canals, seeking salvation in the water. But the heat was so intense that the water in the shallow canals literally boiled. People were boiled alive. The panic that gripped the city only increased the number of victims. Crowds fleeing the fire found themselves trapped in narrow alleys where the wall of flame overtook them. Radio Tokyo hysterically called the raid a massacre, compared it to the burning of Rome under Nero. The comparison was flawed. The destruction of Tokyo was far, far worse. In a single night, over 100,000 people died, more than from the first atomic bomb strike on Hiroshima. 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. Over 1 million people were left homeless. The Japanese morale, built on the idea of divine protection, was broken. The peace movement within the government, previously a quiet whisper, gained immense strength. Even the most die-hard militarist, ready to fight to the last drop of blood, suddenly realized there would be no one left to fight, nowhere left to fight. Losses among the B-29s were high 14 aircraft, but in percentage terms, this was less than in previous, safe, high-precision missions. LeMay's risky tactic had worked. Iron Ass had given the Japanese no chances. He had just proven he could win the war by burning cities. He was just getting started. Tokyo was burning out, but for General Curtis LeMay, this was only the beginning. He gave the Japanese no day of rest, not a single minute to recover from the shock. He put destruction on a conveyor belt. The firestorm that had consumed the capital was not a fluke. It was to become the new normal. On the afternoon of March 11th, as a pillar of black smoke still rose over Tokyo, visible for hundreds of miles, a new armada of 313 bombers was already heading for Nagoya. This time the results were not as apocalyptic. A weaker wind did not allow the fires to merge into a single firestorm. But while the smoke was still rising over Nagoya, 301 superfortresses were already on their way to Osaka, Japan's third largest city, which had not yet suffered massive strikes. Over Osaka, the sky was 80% covered by clouds. They had to bomb by radar. Ironically, this led to an even denser concentration of bombs. The result was a gigantic fire that burned out 8 square miles in the very heart of the city, destroying its main commercial industrial districts. The raid on Osaka proved that the horror of Tokyo was not an accident. It was a system. LeMay conducted 5 such fire raids before the kamikaze crisis during the Battle of Okinawa forced him to temporarily switch the B-29s to tactical strikes on airfields on the island of Kyushu. But the success of these first incendiary missions had definitively convinced him of one revolutionary idea. The official goal of his command was to prepare the Japanese islands for an Allied invasion. But LeMay now saw another path. On April 25, 1945, he wrote a letter to General Norstad in which he clearly stated his opinion he could force Japan to surrender through bombing alone, without an invasion, without 1 million casualties among American soldiers. LeMay was not alone in this thinking. The former ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, General MacArthur, General Kenny, they all believed that Japan was on the brink of collapse. After a nearly month-long pause at the end of May, LeMay resumed his campaign of total destruction. He now had enough resources to put over 500 planes in the air at once. By mid-June, the 6 largest cities surrounding Tokyo Bay had been burned to the ground. On June 15th, the first phase of LeMay's city destruction campaign concluded. The results were staggering. Japan's industrial base lay in ruins. Civilian casualties exceeded 1 million. Hundreds of thousands of people had died. The nation was in agony. The capture of Okinawa allowed B-24s, B-25s, fighter bombers from Iwo Jima to join the raids. The Navy air arms struck from aircraft carriers. The Japanese people were subjected to the most intense aerial bombardment in human history. Their will to resist was melting away with each passing day. On July 26, 1945, President Harry Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. Many in the Japanese government wanted to accept it, but 3 members of the war cabinet objected. The declaration left the fate of the emperor uncertain. It named the country's former leaders as war criminals. For them, this was unacceptable. The war continued. American bombers began dropping millions of leaflets, warning the Japanese that their entire nation was under threat of starvation. This was not an empty threat for a country dependent on food imports. That the Japanese were losing their will to fight became evident on August 4th when pilots of the 5th Air Force, returning from a sortie over Kyushu, reported that people all over the island were flying white flags. 2 days later, on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb exploded in the sky over Hiroshima. The popular myth holds that Japan surrendered precisely because of this new wonder weapon. But the reality, as documents, surveys show, was different. For a nation already bombed into a state of oblivion, for people who every night watched their cities turn into firestorms, the new bomb, though horrific, did not have a decisive effect. Most Japanese living far from Hiroshima only knew that some new powerful weapon had been used, but did not grasp its significance. When President Truman promised a rain of ruin from the air, he was speaking to a country that had been living under that rain for 9 months. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito, for the first time in history, addressed the Japanese people by radio. He announced that the country was surrendering. So, on September 2nd, 1945, on the deck of the battleship Missouri, history came full circle. The Japanese delegation, defeated, humiliated, stood before the victors. When the armada of B-29s flew over them, it was not just an act of showing force, it was the final salute of the weapon that had actually won this war. Japan was brought to its knees not by 2 flashes of atomic fire, but by thousands of raids, millions of incendiary bombs, the iron, ruthless will of General Curtis LeMay, carried on the wings of the silver superfortresses.